Deborah and Ronald abandoned their black baby boy for his looks, ashamed of how others would see him. Years later, they return, desperate for a second chance and forgiveness. Jeremiah must now face the heartbreaking truth behind their decision. Will he ever be able to forgive the parents who once discarded him? Or is the damage beyond repair? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Deborah sank into the threadbare couch, her hand resting on her swollen belly. The small apartment felt even more cramped these days, with unpaid bills piling up on the rickety coffee table. She glanced at Ronald, who stood by the window, his shoulders tense. "We can't keep living like this," Deborah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ronald turned, his eyes tired and worried. "I know, baby. I'm trying. But nobody's hiring." The weight of their situation hung heavy in the air. Outside, the sounds of their neighborhood filtered through the thin walls. Children laughing, a car horn honking, someone's music blaring. It all seemed so far away from their little bubble of anxiety. Deborah shifted uncomfortably. What are people going to say when they see us with a baby? We can barely take care of ourselves. Ronald sat down next to her, taking her hand. "Since when do we care what people think?" "Don't act like you don't care," Deborah snapped. "I see how you flinch when Mrs. Johnson from church gives us those looks." Ronald's jaw tightened. "That old biddy doesn't know our life." "But she's not the only one," Deborah insisted. "Everyone's always watching, judging, and now we're bringing a child into this?" The unspoken fear lingered between them. It wasn't just about money or space. It was about the world their baby would face, a world that often seemed cruel and unforgiving. Deborah's eyes welled up with tears. What if our baby isn't perfect? What if there's something wrong?" Ronald tried to sound reassuring. "Hey now, don't talk like that. Our baby's going to be beautiful." But Deborah couldn't shake the worry. "You don't know that. And even if everything's fine, how are we going to give this child a good life? We can't even pay the electric bill." The silence that followed was deafening. Ronald had no answers, and Deborah's fears seemed to fill every corner of their tiny home. As night fell, they lay in bed, both wide awake. Deborah's hand never left her belly, as if trying to protect her unborn child from the harsh realities waiting outside. Ronald stared at the ceiling, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. They were young, in love, and terrified. The future loomed before them, full of uncertainties and judgments they weren't sure they could face. Weeks later, the delivery room was filled with a tense silence as Deborah cradled her newborn son, Jeremiah. The baby's cries had subsided, but the unease in the air remained palpable. Ronald stood by the bed, his eyes fixed on his son's face, a mix of emotions swirling within him. Jeremiah was healthy, the doctors had assured them. But as Deborah's gaze swept over her child's features, her heart sank. His face was unlike anything she had expected, unconventional in ways she couldn't quite describe. "He's different," Deborah whispered, her voice trembling. Ronald nodded slowly, unable to find words. He reached out to touch Jeremiah's tiny hand, but hesitated, as if afraid of what he might feel. The nurse entered the room, a cheerful smile on her face. "How are we doing in here? Do you need anything?" Deborah instinctively pulled Jeremiah closer to her chest, shielding him from view. "We're fine," she said quickly, her eyes darting nervously to Ronald. As the nurse left, Deborah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "What are we going to do, Ronald? People are going to stare. They're going to talk." Ronald sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped. "I don't know, Deb. I just don't know." The shame they felt was overwhelming. It wasn't just about Jeremiah's appearance. It was about their fears, their insecurities, all bubbling to the surface. Maybe he'll grow into his looks," Ronald offered weakly, but even he didn't believe his words. Deborah shook her head, her voice barely audible. "They're going to mock us, Ronald. Everyone at church, in the neighborhood. They already look down on us. And now..." couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of facing their community, of enduring the stares and whispers, was too much to bear. Ronald tried to put on a brave face. "We'll figure it out, baby. He's our son. We'll love him no matter what." But as he looked at Jeremiah again, doubt crept into his mind. How would they protect their child from a world that could be so cruel? Deborah's tears fell silently as she held Jeremiah close. The joy they should have felt at becoming parents was overshadowed by fear and uncertainty. They were torn between their love for their child and the overwhelming anxiety about what the future held. As they sat in silence, the weight of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. Their little family, already facing so many challenges, now had to confront a reality they never imagined. The emotional conflict simmered beneath the surface, leaving both Deborah and Ronald visibly torn and unsure of what tomorrow would bring. The days following Jeremiah's birth were filled with a suffocating silence. Deborah and Ronald's tiny apartment felt even smaller now, crowded with unspoken fears and crushing guilt. They took turns holding Jeremiah, their touches hesitant, their gazes averted from his face. One night, as Jeremiah's cries echoed through the thin walls, Deborah broke down. "We can't do this, Ronald," she sobbed, her body shaking. "We can't give him the life he deserves." Ronald, his own eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights, nodded slowly. Maybe there's someone out there who can," he whispered, the words hanging heavy in the air. The decision, once spoken, seemed to take on a life of its own. They packed a small bag with Jeremiah's few belongings, their movements mechanical, as if they were watching themselves from afar. Under the cover of darkness, they drove through empty streets, the car's headlights cutting through the night. Jeremiah slept peacefully in his car seat, unaware of the heart-wrenching journey. They found a quiet alley far from prying eyes. Ronald parked the car, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Are we really doing this?" he asked, his voice cracking. Deborah clutched Jeremiah to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "We have to," she whispered. "For him." With trembling hands, they placed Jeremiah in a clean trash can, wrapping him in his favorite blanket. Deborah kissed his forehead one last time, her lips lingering as she fought back sobs. "Someone will find him soon," Ronald said, trying to convince himself as much as Deborah. "He'll have a better life, better than anything we could give him." They stood there for a moment, the weight of their decision crushing them. Then, as if fleeing from their own actions, they rushed back to the car. As they drove away, Deborah's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Ronald gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. The burden of shame that had plagued them since Jeremiah's birth seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a different kind of pain. In the rearview mirror, the alley disappeared into the darkness, and in the distance, barely audible over the hum of the engine, a soft cry echoed through the night. Jeremiah, alone and afraid, calling out for parents who were no longer there. The night was quiet as Laura made her way home from the shelter. Her heart felt full from a day of helping others, but a familiar ache lingered. She had always dreamed of being a mother, but fate had other plans. As she turned a corner, a soft cry caught her attention. There, under a flickering streetlight, stood a disheveled woman cradling a bundle in her arms. Laura's social worker instincts kicked in, and she approached cautiously. "Are you all right?" Laura asked gently. The woman, her eyes wide with worry, looked up. I found him," she stammered. "In the trash. Who would do such a thing?" Laura's heart skipped a beat. "May I?" she asked, holding out her arms. The woman, who introduced herself as Martha, carefully handed over the baby. As Laura cradled him, she felt an instant connection. His unconventional features only made him more beautiful in her eyes. "Where exactly did you find him?" Laura asked, her voice soft but urgent. Martha pointed down the street. "In that alley. I heard crying, and there he was in a trash can. Poor little thing." Laura's mind raced. She knew the proper protocols, the calls she should make. But something deeper, more primal, took over. This baby needed love, protection, and a home. She could provide all of that. "I'm a social worker," Laura explained to Martha. "I can take care of him for now. Make sure he's safe and healthy." Martha nodded, relief washing over her face. "You're an angel," she said. "I didn't know what to do." As Laura held the baby close, she felt a surge of love she had never experienced before. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The church would want to search for his birth parents, and there would be countless hurdles to overcome. But looking into his innocent eyes, Laura knew she would move heaven and earth for this child. "It's okay, little one," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now. I've got you." With a final thank you to Martha, Laura turned towards home, her heart racing with a mix of fear and excitement. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. This baby had found his way into her arms, and she would never let him go. Laura's heart raced as she walked into her modest home, cradling Jeremiah close to her chest. The weight of her decision settled upon her shoulders, but it felt right. She had always dreamed of being a mother, and now, in the most unexpected way, that dream was coming true. "Tom?" she called out softly, not wanting to startle the baby. "Are you home?" Her husband appeared from the kitchen, his kind eyes widening at the sight before him. "Laura, what's—" He trailed off, taking in the small bundle in her arms. Laura's eyes welled with tears as she explained the night's events. Tom listened intently, his expression softening with each word. When she finished, he stepped closer, gently placing a hand on Jeremiah's head. "He needs us, Tom," Laura whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know it's sudden, but—" Tom's warm smile cut her off. "He's perfect, Laura. We've been waiting for this moment for so long." Over the next few weeks, their lives transformed. The church made efforts to locate Jeremiah's birth parents, but no one came forward. Laura and Tom took this as a sign, their hearts already set on making Jeremiah their own. The day they officially adopted Jeremiah was filled with joy and tears. As they stood before the judge, Laura held Jeremiah close, her voice steady as she promised to love and care for him always. Tom's hand rested on her shoulder, a silent pillar of support. Their home, once quiet and filled with longing, now bustled with the sounds of a happy baby. The nursery, which had stood empty for so long, was now a warm haven of soft colors and stuffed animals. Tom had painted clouds on the ceiling, and Laura had filled the bookshelves with stories she couldn't wait to read to their son. Each night as they tucked Jeremiah into his crib, Laura and Tom marveled at the love that filled their hearts. They knew the road ahead might not always be easy, but they were determined to give Jeremiah the life and love his birth parents couldn't provide. "Sweet dreams, little one," Laura would whisper, placing a gentle kiss on Jeremiah's forehead. Tom would wrap his arm around her waist, and they'd stand there, watching their son sleep, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought him into their lives. 20 years passed in the blink of an eye. Jeremiah Hunston, now a successful tech entrepreneur at the age of 25, sat in his sleek office overlooking the city skyline. His company, Innotech Solutions, had become a leader in innovative software development, a testament to his hard work and brilliant mind. Jeremiah's fingers flew across the keyboard as he fine-tuned the code for their latest project. His team had gone home hours ago, but he often found himself working late into the night. It was during these quiet moments that his thoughts would drift to the questions that had haunted him for years. Despite his outward success, Jeremiah carried a deep, invisible scar. The mystery of his birth parents lingered in his heart, an unresolved puzzle that gnawed at him in moments of solitude. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his dark hair, and sighed heavily. "Why wasn't I good enough?" he whispered to the empty room, the familiar ache settling in his chest. His eyes landed on a framed photo on his desk. It was a picture of him and Laura at his college graduation. Her proud smile and loving embrace had been a constant source of strength throughout his life. Laura's unwavering love had been the foundation upon which he had built his success. Jeremiah's phone buzzed with a text from Laura. "Don't work too late, sweetheart. Remember, family dinner tomorrow night." A small smile tugged at his lips as he read the message. Laura's love had never faltered, not once in the 20 years since she had found him. She had been there for every scraped knee, every school play, and every late-night study session. Her belief in him had been the driving force behind his achievements. Yet, even as gratitude filled his heart, the nagging questions remained. Who were his birth parents? Why had they abandoned him? What would his life have been like if they had kept him? Jeremiah turned back to his computer, throwing himself into his work. It was easier to focus on lines of code than to dwell on the unanswered questions of his past. But even as he immersed himself in the familiar world of algorithms and data structures, a part of him knew that someday he would have to confront the mystery of his origins. As the years passed, life had not been kind to Deborah and Ronald. Now, in their late 50s, they found themselves living in a rundown apartment on the outskirts of town. The walls were thin, the paint peeling, and the constant drip of a leaky faucet served as a reminder of their dire circumstances. Deborah sat on a worn-out couch, her once vibrant eyes now dulled by years of hardship. Ronald stood by the window, his shoulders slumped under the weight of their struggles. The small TV in the corner flickered to life, its fuzzy picture the only source of entertainment they could afford. "And now we have a special guest on our show today," the TV host announced cheerfully. "Please welcome Jeremiah Hunston, the brilliant mind behind InnoTech Solutions." Deborah's attention perked up at the name. She leaned forward, squinting at the screen. A handsome young man with unconventional features walked onto the set, smiling and waving at the audience. "Jeremiah, it's wonderful to have you here," the host said. "Your success story is truly inspiring. Can you tell us a bit about your background?" Jeremiah nodded, his expression turning serious. "Well, it's not a typical story," he began. "I was actually abandoned as a baby." Deborah's breath caught in her throat. She reached out, grabbing Ronald's arm. "Ronald," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look." Ronald turned from the window, his eyes widening as he took in the man on the screen. They listened, transfixed, as Jeremiah continued his story. "I was found in a trash can by a homeless woman," Jeremiah explained, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of his words. "But then, a kind-hearted social worker named Laura took me in. She raised me as her own, giving me all the love and support I could ever need." Tears welled up in Deborah's eyes as the realization hit her. The baby they had abandoned so long ago, the child they had been too ashamed and scared to keep, had grown into this successful, accomplished man. Ronald sank onto the couch beside Deborah, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "It can't be," he muttered, but deep down, he knew it was true. As Jeremiah continued to speak about his journey from abandoned child to tech entrepreneur, Deborah and Ronald sat in stunned silence. The weight of their past decision crashed down upon them, heavier than ever before. "What have we done?" Deborah whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned to Ronald, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret, guilt, and a desperate hope. "We have to find him, Ronald. We have to try to make this right." Ronald nodded slowly, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But how?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "After all this time, after what we did, how can we possibly ask for forgiveness?" The TV continued to play in the background, Jeremiah's voice a constant reminder of the life they had missed, the son they had given up. As they sat there, overwhelmed by the enormity of their realization, Deborah and Ronald began to contemplate the impossible task of finding Jeremiah and seeking his forgiveness. After a few days, Deborah and Ronald stood outside the gleaming glass building that housed InnoTech Solutions. Their worn clothes and weathered faces contrasted sharply with the sleek, modern exterior. Deborah's hands shook as she clutched her purse while Ronald tried to steady his breathing. "Are you sure about this?" Ronald asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Deborah nodded, her eyes fixed on the entrance. "We have to try, Ronald. We owe him that much." They had spent days practicing what they would say, rehearsing their story over and over. Now, as they approached the revolving doors, all those carefully prepared words seemed to vanish from their minds. The lobby was bustling with activity. Well-dressed professionals hurried past, barely sparing a glance at the out-of-place couple. Deborah and Ronald made their way to the reception desk, their hearts pounding. A young woman with a bright smile greeted them. "Welcome to Innotech Solutions. How may I help you today?" Deborah swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she spoke. We need to see Jeremiah Hunston. Please, it's very important." The receptionist's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Hunston is very busy. Do you have an appointment?" "No, we don't," Ronald interjected, his voice stronger than he felt. "But we're his birth parents." The receptionist's eyes widened in shock. She glanced between them, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. I see. One moment, please." As she picked up the phone, Deborah and Ronald exchanged nervous glances. This was it. The moment they had been dreading and hopping for all at once. Several floors above, Jeremiah was in his office reviewing reports when his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Hunston, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation downstairs." Jeremiah looked up, curious. "What kind of situation?" His assistant hesitated before continuing. "There are 2 people at reception claiming to be your birth parents. They're asking to see you." The words hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face as a whirlwind of emotions swept through him. Shock, anger, curiosity, and a deep, aching sadness he thought he had long buried. "Sir?" his assistant prompted gently. "What would you like me to do?" Jeremiah sat frozen, his mind racing. The parents who had abandoned him, who had left him in a trash can, were here, in his building, wanting to see him. He wasn't prepared for this. How could anyone be prepared for something like this? Jeremiah took a deep breath, steadying himself. With a nod to his assistant, he said, "Send them up." Minutes later, a soft knock on his office door made Jeremiah's heart race. "Come in," he called, his voice surprisingly steady. The door opened, and Deborah and Ronald stepped inside. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken emotions. Jeremiah stood behind his desk, his hands gripping the edge tightly. "Hello, Jeremiah," Deborah said softly, her eyes brimming with tears. We're your parents." Jeremiah's jaw clenched. "You're the people who left me in a trash can," he corrected, his voice cold. Ronald flinched at the words. "We know we can never make up for what we did," he said. "But we hoped you might listen to our story." Jeremiah gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. As they sat, he remained standing, needing the physical distance. "We were so young," Deborah began, her voice trembling, "and so poor. We could barely feed ourselves, let alone a baby." "We were scared," Ronald added. "Scared of what people would think. Scared we couldn't give you a good life." As they spoke, Jeremiah listened, his emotions swirling. Anger, hurt, and curiosity battled within him. Part of him wanted to throw them out, to never see them again. But another part, a part he didn't fully understand, felt compelled to hear more. "We know now that what we did was wrong," Deborah said, wiping away a tear. "We've regretted it every day since." Jeremiah closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process everything. When he opened them, he saw 2 broken people before him, weighed down by years of guilt and shame. I need time to think about all this," Jeremiah said finally. "It's a lot to take in." Deborah nodded eagerly. "Of course we understand. We don't expect forgiveness. We just wanted you to know the truth." Jeremiah surprised himself with his next words. Would you be willing to meet for dinner? Maybe next week? I have questions, and I think I need more time to hear your story." The hope that blossomed on Deborah and Ronald's faces was almost painful to see. They agreed quickly, and Jeremiah's assistant arranged the details. As they left his office, Jeremiah sank into his chair, overwhelmed. He had just agreed to have dinner with the people who had abandoned him. The pain of his childhood, the questions that had haunted him for years, all came rushing back. Yet beneath it all, a small spark of curiosity flickered. Who were these people? What was their story? And could he ever find it in his heart to understand, if not forgive, what they had done? The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversation as Jeremiah, Laura, and her husband Tom arrived. Jeremiah's stomach churned with anxiety as he spotted Deborah and Ronald already seated at a corner table. "We're right here with you, sweetheart," Laura whispered, squeezing his arm gently. As they approached, Deborah and Ronald stood, their faces a mix of hope and fear. Jeremiah nodded stiffly, unable to bring himself to smile. "Thank you for coming," Ronald said, his voice trembling slightly. They all sat down, an awkward silence settling over the table. Laura and Tom introduced themselves, their warm presence a stark contrast to the tension between Jeremiah and his birth parents. As they ordered their meals, Deborah cleared her throat. "Jeremiah, we want to apologize again for what we did." Jeremiah's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "We were young and scared," Ronald added, his eyes pleading. "We thought we were doing what was best for you." Jeremiah's voice was low and controlled when he finally spoke. "Best for me? How was leaving me in a trash can best for me?" Deborah flinched at his words. "We were wrong, so wrong. We were poor, and we were afraid of what people would think about your appearance." The confession hit Jeremiah like a punch to the gut. He felt the blood drain from his face as the realization sank in. They had abandoned him because of how he looked. You threw me away because I wasn't good enough?" Jeremiah's voice cracked, the pain evident in every word. Laura reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm, but Jeremiah barely felt it. He was lost in a whirlwind of hurt and anger. Deborah and Ronald exchanged a panicked look. No, that's not what we meant," Ronald stammered. "We were just young and foolish. We made a terrible mistake." But their explanations fell flat, sounding hollow and self-serving to Jeremiah's ears. He felt as though he was suffocating, the weight of their rejection crushing him anew. Tom, seeing Jeremiah's distress, placed a strong hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, son. Take a deep breath," he said softly. Jeremiah struggled to compose himself, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. He had thought he was prepared for this conversation, but the reality of it was overwhelming. Across the table, Deborah and Ronald watched helplessly as their son battled with the pain they had caused. "Please, Jeremiah," Deborah pleaded, her voice thick with emotion. "We know we don't deserve it, but we're begging for your forgiveness. We've regretted our decision every day since." Ronald nodded earnestly. "We've carried this guilt for so long, we just want a chance to make things right, to be a part of your life if you'll let us." Their words washed over Jeremiah, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. The hurt was too fresh, too raw. He sat there, torn between the urge to flee and the need to understand, as Tom's comforting presence anchored him to his seat. Jeremiah abruptly stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I need some air," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. Without waiting for a response, he turned and strode quickly towards the restaurant's exit. The cool night air hit his face as he stepped outside, and Jeremiah took a deep, shuddering breath. He leaned against the building's wall, closing his eyes and trying to steady himself. The weight of Deborah and Ronald's revelation pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. "They didn't want me because of how I looked," he whispered to himself, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away furiously. As he stood there grappling with his tumultuous emotions, Jeremiah felt a surge of anger rising within him. It wasn't just directed at Deborah and Ronald, but at a world that had made them feel so insecure, so afraid of judgment that they'd abandon their own child. After several minutes, Jeremiah took another deep breath and straightened up. He felt drained, but a new determination had taken root inside him. He needed answers, real ones this time. Squaring his shoulders, Jeremiah walked back into the restaurant. As he approached the table, he could see the concern etched on Laura and Tom's faces, and the nervous anticipation on Deborah and Ronald's. "I'm sorry for walking out," Jeremiah said as he sat down, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "But I need to know something." He turned to face Deborah and Ronald directly, his gaze intense. "How could you let your insecurities define my worth?" he asked, his words cutting through the tension at the table. "I was just a baby. I needed love and protection, not judgment." Deborah and Ronald exchanged a pained look, the weight of Jeremiah's words clearly hitting them hard. "We were wrong, so wrong," Deborah began, her voice trembling. "We let our fears and the opinions of others cloud our judgment." Ronald nodded, his face etched with regret. "We were young and foolish, and we made a terrible mistake. We thought we were protecting you from a hard life, but we were really just protecting ourselves from our own insecurities." Jeremiah leaned forward, his anger giving way to a desperate need for understanding. "But why?" he pressed. "Why did you care so much about what others thought? I was your son." The tension at the table was palpable as Jeremiah waited for their response, determined to confront the painful truth of his abandonment head-on. Deborah and Ronald exchanged a look of deep sorrow before turning back to Jeremiah. Their faces were etched with lines of worry and regret, making them appear even older than their years. "We know nothing we say can excuse what we did," Deborah said softly, her voice quivering. "But we were so young, so scared. We thought we were doing what was best for you." Ronald nodded, his eyes downcast. "We were wrong, terribly wrong. We let our fears control us, and we've regretted it every day since." Jeremiah listened, his jaw clenched tight. He could feel Laura's comforting hand on his arm, grounding him as he faced this emotional storm. "That doesn't make it right," Jeremiah said, his voice low but firm. "You abandoned me because you were ashamed of how I looked. How am I supposed to forgive that?" Deborah's eyes filled with tears. "We don't expect you to forgive us, Jeremiah. We don't deserve it. But there's something else you need to know." She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "We had another child a few years after we left you. His name is Michael." Jeremiah felt as if the air had been knocked out of him. A brother? He had a brother he never knew about? "Michael is very sick," Ronald added, his voice barely above a whisper. "The doctors say he doesn't have much time left." The restaurant around them seemed to fade away as Jeremiah processed this new information. His mind was reeling, trying to make sense of it all. "We're not here to ask for money," Deborah said quickly, seeing the shock on Jeremiah's face. We wanted to make things right before it's too late, for Michael's sake and for ours." Jeremiah sat back in his chair, feeling overwhelmed. He looked at Laura, seeking comfort in her familiar, loving face. She squeezed his hand, offering silent support. "I don't know what to say," Jeremiah finally managed. It's a lot to take in." He turned back to Deborah and Ronald, his emotions a confusing mix of anger, hurt, and an unexpected twinge of compassion. "Tell me about Michael," he said softly. As Deborah began to speak about the brother he never knew, Jeremiah found himself torn. Part of him wanted to hold on to his anger, to reject these people who had caused him so much pain. But another part, the part that had been raised with love and compassion by Laura and Tom, felt a pull towards this unknown sibling. The revelation of Michael's existence and his terminal illness added a new layer of complexity to Jeremiah's already tumultuous emotions. He listened intently, trying to reconcile his feelings of betrayal with this newfound knowledge of a family he never knew he had. Jeremiah sat alone in his apartment, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. The revelation about Michael had shaken him to his core. He paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair, trying to make sense of it all. "A brother," he whispered to himself, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "I have a brother." The weight of this new knowledge pressed down on him, mixing with the pain of learning the true reason for his abandonment. It wasn't just poverty that had driven his parents to leave him. It was shame. Shame over how he looked. The realization cut deep, reopening old wounds he thought had long since healed. Jeremiah's phone buzzed. It was a text from Laura. "Remember, sweetheart, God is with you in this. Take time to pray and listen for his guidance." He smiled softly, grateful for her unwavering support. Then another message came through, this time from Tom, Laura's husband. "Son, don't rush into anything. Take the time you need to process this. We're here for you." Their words of comfort wrapped around him like a warm blanket, but the conflict within him remained. Jeremiah sank onto his couch, burying his face in his hands. "How can I forgive them?" he asked the empty room. "They didn't just leave me because they were poor. They were ashamed of me." The pain of this truth felt like a physical ache in his chest. Yet, as he sat there, another thought crept in. The image of a brother he'd never met, lying in a hospital bed somewhere, running out of time. Jeremiah's mind raced with questions. What was Michael like? Did he know about Jeremiah? And most pressingly, what was the right thing to do now? He closed his eyes, trying to follow Laura's advice to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself wrestling with his feelings, torn between the hurt child within him and the compassionate man he'd become. "God," he finally whispered, "I don't know what to do. I'm angry. I'm hurt. But there's this brother I never knew about, and he's dying. How am I supposed to handle all of this?" As he sat in the silence that followed, Jeremiah felt the full weight of his situation. He was being asked to consider forgiveness for a betrayal that cut to the very core of his being. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that Michael's existence changed things in ways he couldn't fully grasp yet. Jeremiah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. He knew he had a decision to make, but he felt utterly unprepared for it. The path ahead was unclear, clouded by the pain of the past and the unexpected complications of the present. Deborah and Ronald stood outside the hospital, their faces etched with worry. The weight of their past decisions hung heavy on their shoulders as they prepared to visit Michael. With trembling hands, Deborah pushed open the door and they made their way to their son's room. The sterile smell of the hospital hit them as they entered. Michael lay in bed, his face pale and drawn. The beeping of machines filled the air, a constant reminder of his fragile state. "Hey, buddy," Ronald said softly, his voice cracking. "How are you feeling today?" Michael managed a weak smile. "Been better, Dad." As they settled in, the doctor entered the room. His face was serious as he flipped through Michael's chart. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, may I speak with you outside for a moment?" Deborah's heart raced as they followed the doctor into the hallway. She gripped Ronald's hand tightly, bracing for the news. "I'm afraid Michael's condition has worsened," the doctor explained gently. "We're doing everything we can, but—" He paused, his eyes filled with sympathy. "You should prepare yourselves." Deborah felt her knees go weak. She leaned against the wall, her body shaking with silent sobs. Ronald stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. How long?" Ronald managed to ask. The doctor shook his head. "It's hard to say. Days, maybe weeks. I'm sorry." As the doctor left, Deborah turned to Ronald, her eyes wild with desperation. "We need to talk to Jeremiah again. We have to make him understand. We can't lose both our sons." Ronald nodded, his own eyes brimming with tears. "I know, Deb, but we can't force him. We've hurt him so much already." They returned to Michael's room, trying to compose themselves. But as Deborah looked at her younger son, so frail in the hospital bed, she couldn't hold back anymore. She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry, baby, I'm so sorry," she cried, clutching Michael's hand. Ronald, usually the stoic one, felt his own composure crumbling. He turned away, his shoulders shaking as he tried to muffle his cries. Michael looked between his parents, confusion and concern on his face. "Mom, Dad, what's wrong? Is it about Jeremiah?" Deborah wiped her eyes, trying to pull herself together for Michael's sake. "We're just worried, sweetheart. We want you to get better, and we want your brother to forgive us." Ronald came back to the bedside, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder. "We've made mistakes, son, big ones. and now we're afraid we might not have time to make things right." As they sat with Michael, Deborah and Ronald exchanged a look of understanding. They needed to give Jeremiah more time, but time was the one thing they didn't have. The fear that they might never reconcile with their firstborn before Michael's condition worsened hung over them like a dark cloud. Jeremiah sat in Laura's cozy living room, his shoulders slumped and his eyes filled with turmoil. The warm glow of the table lamp cast a soft light on his face, highlighting the deep creases of worry that had formed over the past few days. "I just don't know what to do, Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I think about them, I feel this anger burning inside me." Laura reached out and took his hand, her touch as comforting as it had been when he was a child. "Sweetie, forgiveness isn't about excusing what they did to you. It's about finding peace for yourself." Jeremiah shook his head, struggling to understand. "But how can I find peace when they hurt me so deeply? They were ashamed of me, Mom. How do I get past that?" Laura's husband, John, leaned forward in his armchair. "Son, it's okay to feel angry. What they did was wrong. But holding on to that anger, it's only hurting you more." Jeremiah stood up abruptly, pacing the room. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "And now there's Michael. I've never even met him, but I feel this responsibility. He's dying, and I'm supposed to just forgive and forget?" Laura's eyes filled with tears as she watched her son struggle. "Nobody's asking you to forget, Jeremiah. But forgiveness, it could free you from this pain you're carrying." Jeremiah stopped by the window, staring out into the darkness. He felt lost, adrift in a sea of confusion and hurt. The idea of forgiving Deborah and Ronald seemed impossible, yet the thought of holding on to this anger forever was equally unbearable. As the days passed, Jeremiah found himself withdrawing more and more. At work, he went through the motions, his usual passion and drive noticeably absent. His colleagues exchanged worried glances as he sat silently in meetings, his mind clearly elsewhere. Even at home, Jeremiah struggled to connect. He spent hours alone in his study, staring at old family photos, trying to reconcile the love he felt for Laura and Tom with the pain caused by his birth parents. One evening, as he sat at his desk, his phone buzzed with a message from Laura. "Thinking of you, sweetie. Remember, you're strong enough to get through this. We love you." Jeremiah's eyes welled up with tears. He wanted to respond, to reach out, but he felt paralyzed by his emotions. Instead, he turned off his phone and buried his face in his hands, feeling more alone than ever. The internal conflict raged on, tearing Jeremiah apart. He was trapped between anger and the desire for peace, between resentment and the pull of family ties he never knew existed. As the days wore on, Jeremiah found himself retreating further into his shell, unsure of how to move forward or find the peace that seemed so elusive. Next day, Jeremiah sat at his desk, staring blankly at the computer screen before him. The once bustling office now felt eerily quiet, a reflection of the company's declining fortunes. His emotional turmoil had taken its toll, not just on him but on the business he had built from the ground up. "Mr. Hunston?" His assistant's voice startled him out of his reverie. "The board members are waiting in the conference room." Jeremiah nodded, his heart heavy as he made his way to face the music. As he entered the room, the tense atmosphere was palpable. The board members' faces were grim, their disappointment evident. "Jeremiah," the chairperson began, her voice stern, "we need to discuss the company's current situation. Our stocks have plummeted by 30% in the last month alone." The words hit Jeremiah like a punch to the gut. He knew things had been bad, but he hadn't realized the extent of the damage. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that his recent emotional absence had led to critical mistakes and missed opportunities. "We're facing a serious financial crisis," another board member chimed in. "If things don't turn around quickly, we might have to consider drastic measures." Jeremiah felt the weight of their words crushing him. The company he had poured his heart and soul into was crumbling, and it was his fault. He tried to focus, to come up with solutions, but his mind kept drifting back to his personal struggles. As he left the meeting, Jeremiah felt more lost than ever. His professional world was falling apart, mirroring the turmoil in his personal life. He wandered through the office, barely noticing the concerned glances from his employees. Back in his office, Jeremiah slumped into his chair. He picked up a framed photo of himself with Laura and John at his company's launch party. Their proud smiles seemed to mock him now. How had he let things get so out of control? The ringing of his phone jolted him back to reality. It was Deborah, his birth mother. Jeremiah stared at the screen, his finger hovering over the decline button. He couldn't deal with this now, not when everything else was falling apart. As the phone continued to ring, Jeremiah felt overwhelmed by the weight of his unresolved past and his crumbling present. He put his head in his hands, feeling more lost and alone than he had in years. The silence that followed was deafening. Jeremiah looked up, his eyes landing on the cityscape outside his window. He had always found solace in the bustling city below, but now it only reminded him of how disconnected he felt from everything and everyone. In that moment, Jeremiah wondered if he would ever find peace. Could he salvage his company without first resolving the turmoil within himself? The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered. That evening, Jeremiah stood outside the hospital room, his hand hesitating on the doorknob. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled his nostrils, making his stomach churn. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before pushing the door open. The sight that greeted him made his heart clench. There, lying in the hospital bed, was Michael, his brother, a stranger he had never known existed until recently. Michael's thin frame was barely visible beneath the blankets, his face gaunt and pale. The steady beep of monitors filled the otherwise quiet room. As Jeremiah approached the bed, Michael's eyes fluttered open. A weak smile spread across his face. "You must be Jeremiah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom and Dad told me about you." Jeremiah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed, studying the face of the brother he never knew. Despite their different circumstances, Jeremiah could see a resemblance. The same dark eyes, the same curve of the jaw. "Thank you for coming," Michael said, reaching out a frail hand. Jeremiah took it gently, surprised by the surge of emotion that washed over him. "I've always wondered what it would be like to have a big brother." The simple statement hit Jeremiah like a tidal wave. Here was Michael facing the end of his life, yet expressing gratitude for this small moment. The anger and resentment that had been festering in Jeremiah's heart began to soften. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you growing up," Jeremiah found himself saying, his voice thick with emotion. Michael shook his head slightly. "Don't be. You're here now. That's what matters." As they talked, Jeremiah felt a shift within himself. The bitterness that had consumed him for so long began to ebb away, replaced by a sense of connection he hadn't expected. Michael's acceptance, his lack of judgment or expectation, touched something deep within Jeremiah. Looking at his brother's fragile form, Jeremiah realized that holding on to his anger was only hurting himself. The past couldn't be changed, but he had the power to shape his future. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet beeps of hospital machinery and the gentle presence of a brother he'd just met, Jeremiah made a decision. He would forgive his birth parents, not for their sake, but for his own. For Michael's sake. For the sake of the little boy left in a trash can who had grown into a man carrying too much pain. As Michael's eyes began to droop with fatigue, Jeremiah squeezed his hand gently. "Rest now," he said softly. "I'll be here when you wake up." Next day, Jeremiah visits again the hospital. Jeremiah stood outside Michael's hospital room, his heart pounding. He could see Deborah and Ronald through the small window, sitting by Michael's bedside. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Deborah's face crumpled, tears already forming in her eyes. Ronald stood up, his usually stoic demeanor cracking slightly. "Jeremiah," Deborah whispered, her voice trembling. Jeremiah nodded, his jaw clenched tight. He looked at Michael, sleeping peacefully before turning back to his birth parents. The emotions he'd been holding back for so long suddenly burst forth. "Do you have any idea what it's like?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "To grow up knowing you were thrown away like trash? To wonder every single day why you weren't good enough for your own parents to love you?" Deborah let out a sob, covering her mouth with her hand. Ronald's shoulders sagged, the weight of guilt visible in his posture. "I'm so sorry, Jeremiah," Deborah cried, reaching out towards him. "We were young, scared, and foolish. We thought we were doing what was best for you, but we were wrong. So terribly wrong." Jeremiah shook his head, tears now streaming down his face. "You were ashamed of me, of how I looked. How could you do that to your own child?" Ronald, who had remained quiet until now, suddenly broke down. His stoic facade crumbled as he fell to his knees in front of Jeremiah. "It was the biggest mistake of our lives," Ronald confessed, his voice choked with emotion. "We've lived with that regret every day since. I tried to convince myself it was the right thing to do, but I was lying to myself. We abandoned you, and there's no excuse for that." Jeremiah stood there, his heart torn between the anger he'd carried for so long and the unexpected compassion he felt seeing his birth parents so broken. "We don't deserve your forgiveness," Deborah said softly, moving to stand beside Ronald. "But please know that we've loved you every day since. We were too weak, too scared to face our mistakes. But we never stopped loving you." The room fell silent again, filled only with the sound of quiet sobs and the steady beep of Michael's monitors. Jeremiah looked at each of them, Deborah's tear-stained face, Ronald's bowed head, and Michael's peaceful form. He felt the weight of their shared pain, the years of separation and regret. Jeremiah stumbled out of the hospital, his emotions swirling like a storm inside him. The cool evening air hit his face, and he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He found a nearby bench and sank onto it, burying his face in his hands. The weight of the confrontation pressed down on him. For so long he had imagined this moment, facing the people who had abandoned him. But now that it had happened, he felt drained and confused. As he sat there, memories flooded his mind. He remembered the countless nights he'd spent as a child, wondering why his birth parents didn't want him. The pain of rejection had shaped every aspect of his life. His drive for success, his difficulty trusting others, even his fear of not being good enough. "You're more than enough, sweetheart," Laura's voice echoed in his mind. Her unwavering love had been his anchor through the years. And now, her words about forgiveness came back to him. "Forgiveness isn't about excusing the pain, Jeremiah. It's about finding peace for yourself." Jeremiah lifted his head, looking up at the darkening sky. Could he really let go of all this hurt? The anger had been a part of him for so long, it was hard to imagine life without it. But as he sat there, he began to realize something. Holding on to this pain wasn't punishing Deborah and Ronald. It was punishing himself. It was keeping him from fully embracing the love and joy in his life, always holding a part of himself back. He thought about Michael lying in that hospital bed. Life was so fragile, so precious. Did he want to spend the rest of his days carrying this burden? Slowly, Jeremiah felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a sudden change, but a gradual loosening of the tight knot of anger in his chest. He didn't have to forget what happened, but maybe he could choose to stop letting it control him. Taking another deep breath, Jeremiah made a decision. He would forgive Deborah and Ronald, not for their sake, but for his own. It was time to release the emotional weight he'd been carrying for so long. As this realization settled over him, Jeremiah felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced before. The pain wasn't gone, but it no longer felt all-consuming. For the first time in years, he felt truly free. Jeremiah took a deep breath and slowly made his way back to Michael's hospital room. His heart pounded as he pushed the door open, finding Deborah and Ronald still there, their faces etched with worry and guilt. As he entered, they both looked up, their eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. Jeremiah cleared his throat, his voice shaky but determined. "I've been thinking," he began, his gaze moving between Deborah and Ronald. "And I want you to know that I forgive you. The words hung in the air for a moment. Deborah's hand flew to her mouth, tears immediately welling up in her eyes. Ronald stood stock still, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I forgive you," Jeremiah repeated, his own eyes filling with tears. "Not because what you did was okay, but because I need to let go of this pain for my own sake." Deborah broke down, her sobs echoing in the small room. Ronald, his stoic facade finally crumbling, let out a choked cry and reached for Jeremiah's hand. Jeremiah allowed the contact, but his body remained tense. "I can't erase the past," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "And this doesn't mean everything is okay between us. But I'm choosing to forgive you, to free myself from the weight of anger and resentment I've carried for so long." Ronald nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "We understand, son. We don't deserve your forgiveness, but we're so grateful for it." Deborah, still crying, managed to speak through her tears. "We know things can never be the same, Jeremiah, but thank you. Thank you for finding it in your heart to forgive us." The three stood there, all in tears, the weight of the moment palpable in the room. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step towards healing, for all of them. Jeremiah's attention shifted to Michael, who lay motionless on the hospital bed. The steady beep of the heart monitor seemed to grow fainter with each passing moment. Jeremiah moved closer, his eyes fixed on his brother's pale face. "Michael," he whispered, gently taking his brother's frail hand in his own. "I'm here." Michael's eyelids fluttered open, his gaze unfocused but somehow finding Jeremiah's face. A weak smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you for coming," Michael breathed, his voice barely audible. Jeremiah felt a lump form in his throat. He squeezed Michael's hand, trying to convey all the love and support he could through that simple touch. "Of course, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The room fell silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the machines. Deborah and Ronald stood back, their tears falling silently as they watched their two sons together for the first and last time. As the minutes ticked by, Michael's breathing became more labored. Jeremiah leaned in closer, his heart breaking for the brother he never knew. "It's okay, Michael," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You can rest now. I'm here with you." Michael's eyes found Jeremiah's once more, a flicker of peace passing over his face. With one last shuddering breath, Michael closed his eyes, and the steady beep of the heart monitor turned into a long, continuous tone. Jeremiah felt the weight of the moment crash over him. Tears streamed down his face as he held onto Michael's hand, now limp and growing cold. The raw emotions of loss and grief overwhelmed him, and he let out a quiet sob. In that heart-wrenching moment, Jeremiah mourned not just for Michael's passing, but for all the years they could have had together. The birthdays, the shared laughter, the brotherly bond, all lost to time and circumstance. As he sat there holding his brother's hand, Jeremiah felt a profound shift within himself. The importance of love and forgiveness crystallized in his heart. Despite the pain, he found solace in knowing that he had been there for Michael in his final moments, offering him comfort and peace. As the reality of Michael's passing settled in, Jeremiah found himself faced with a new challenge. He looked at Deborah and Ronald, their faces etched with grief and worry. Despite the pain they had caused him, he couldn't ignore their obvious distress. Taking a deep breath, Jeremiah approached them. "I know this is a difficult time," he said softly. "I want to help with the immediate things you need to take care of." Deborah's eyes widened in surprise. You want to help us?" Jeremiah nodded, his expression a mix of compassion and resolve. "Yes, but I need you to understand something. I'm willing to support you as you find your footing, but our relationship, it can't go back to what it might have been." Ronald swallowed hard, nodding in understanding. "We don't deserve your kindness, Jeremiah." "Maybe not," Jeremiah agreed, his voice steady. "But it's not about what you deserve. It's about who I choose to be." Over the next few days, Jeremiah helped Deborah and Ronald navigate the painful process of arranging Michael's funeral. He made phone calls, helped with paperwork, and even offered to cover some of the costs. But through it all, he maintained a careful distance, setting clear boundaries. "I can help you find a more stable living situation," Jeremiah told them one afternoon. "But I want to be clear. This doesn't mean I'm inviting you into my life fully. I need time and space to heal." Deborah nodded, tears in her eyes. "We understand, Jeremiah. Your forgiveness and help. It's more than we could have ever hoped for." As the days passed, Jeremiah's actions demonstrated a level of emotional maturity that surprised even him. He found himself balancing compassion with self-protection, offering support while still guarding his heart. One evening, as Jeremiah was helping Ronald sort through some financial documents, Ronald looked up at him with wonder. "You're an incredible person, Jeremiah. The way you've handled all of this, it's more than we deserve." Jeremiah paused, considering his words carefully. "I'm doing what feels right to me. But please understand, this doesn't erase the past. I'm helping because I choose to, not because I owe you anything." Jeremiah pulled up to Laura and her husband's cozy home, his heart full of emotions. As he stepped out of the car, he took a deep breath, steadying himself. The front door opened before he could even knock, and Laura's warm smile greeted him. "Jeremiah, honey," she said, pulling him into a tight hug. Come in, come in." Inside, Laura's husband was waiting in the living room. He stood up, concern etched on his face. "How are you holding up, son?" Jeremiah sank into the familiar comfort of their well-worn couch. "It's been intense," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Laura sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Tell us everything, sweetheart." For the next hour, Jeremiah poured out his heart, recounting the painful conversations with Deborah and Ronald, Michael's passing, and his decision to help them. As he spoke, tears welled up in his eyes. "I don't know how I found the strength to forgive them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But then I realized it was because of you both." Laura and her husband exchanged a glance, their eyes shining with love and pride. Jeremiah continued, his voice growing stronger. "You raised me with so much love and compassion. You taught me what it means to be kind, even when it's hard. Without you, I don't think I could have done it." Laura's husband leaned forward, resting a hand on Jeremiah's shoulder. "You did that all on your own, son. We just gave you the tools." Jeremiah shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "No, it was more than that. You gave me a home, a family. You showed me what unconditional love looks like. That's why I could forgive them, because I knew what real love was, thanks to you." Laura wiped a tear from her cheek. "Oh, Jeremiah, you've always had such a big heart. We're so proud of the man you've become." As they sat there, surrounded by the warmth of their love, Jeremiah felt a sense of peace wash over him. He looked at Laura and her husband, his real parents in every way that mattered, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "I love you both so much," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for everything, for giving me a home, for loving me despite my flaws, for teaching me how to be a good person. I wouldn't be who I am today without you." Laura pulled him into another hug and her husband joined in. In that moment, surrounded by their embrace, Jeremiah knew that no matter what challenges life threw at him, he would always have this, the enduring love of the family who had chosen him. Jeremiah sat on the porch swing at Laura and her husband's home, gently rocking back and forth. The setting sun painted the sky in warm hues, mirroring the peace that had finally settled in his heart. Laura brought out a tray of lemonade, joining him on the swing. "You seem different, honey," she observed, handing him a glass. Jeremiah smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I feel different, Mom. For the first time in my life, I feel whole." Laura's husband stepped out onto the porch, pulling up a chair to join them. "That's wonderful to hear, son." Jeremiah took a sip of lemonade, savoring the moment. "You know, I never thought I'd be able to forgive Deborah and Ronald. But somehow I did. And it's like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders." Laura nodded, her eyes brimming with pride. "Forgiveness is a powerful thing. It's not about excusing what they did, but about freeing yourself." "Exactly," Jeremiah agreed. I realized that holding on to that anger and pain was only hurting me. Letting it go, it's like I can finally breathe. He paused, looking out at the sunset. And Michael, I wish I had known him longer, but I'm grateful for the time we had. It made me appreciate what I have even more. Laura's husband leaned forward, his voice gentle. Life has a way of coming full circle, doesn't it? Jeremiah nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. It does. And through it all, you two have been my constant, my rock. I can't thank you enough for that. Laura squeezed his hand. Oh, sweetheart, loving you has been the greatest joy of our lives. As they sat there watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jeremiah felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. He had faced his past, confronted his deepest fears, and come out stronger on the other side. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had led him right where he needed to be. I'm finally at peace with my past, Jeremiah said softly, and I'm excited for the future, whatever it may bring. Laura and her husband exchanged a loving glance, their hearts full of joy for their son. In that moment, surrounded by the love of his true family, Jeremiah knew that he had found his happily ever after. The wounds of his past had healed, leaving behind a stronger, more compassionate man. And as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Jeremiah felt a sense of hope and possibility that he had never known before. If you enjoyed the story of Jeremiah, Deborah, Ronald, and Laura, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.